All right, in this video, we're continuing our discussion of AUC Section 260 for our communications with those charged with governance. And up until this point, we have learned who those charged with governance are, what needs to be communicated, and now we're going to learn the communication process. So first, we need to establish the communication process, and so that means we should communicate with those charged with governance the form, timing, and expected general content of the communications. So basically, we need to tell them what, when, and how we will communicate with them. And so we'll communicate in writing with those charged with governance the findings or issues from the audit, and that's what we discussed in the last video. And we see here that it's not necessarily required to be in writing, but it's usually preferable. But if we don't feel that oral communication would be adequate for our purposes, and also we don't need to include matters that arose during the course of the audit that were communicated with those charged with governance, but that were satisfactorily resolved. And next, when we provide this written communication, we need to restrict its use because this is a byproduct of the audit report, and so we should indicate in the communication that it's intended solely for the information used with those charged with governance and management, if that's appropriate, and it's intended not intended to be and should not be used by anyone other than these specified parties. So that restricts the use of this particular governance letter that we wrote. And next, regarding the timing of communication, which we should communicate with those charged with governance on a timely basis. That's pretty vague, and hopefully they give us some more information about that at A42 through 43, and we'll jump down there here in a second. But finally, the adequacy of the communication process. We should evaluate whether the two-way communication between us and those charged with governance has been adequate for the purpose of the audit. If it hasn't, then we should evaluate the effect, if any, on the auditor's assessment of the risk of material misstatement and ability to obtain sufficient appropriate audit evidence and should take appropriate action. So, for example, if we didn't feel like our communication with those charged with governance was effective, we might not have obtained all the information that we could have as evidence to support our risk assessment or our conclusions, and vice versa. We may not have given enough information to those charged with governance so that they could make sure that they know the issues with the company, that are the responsibilities of their role. So anyway, we've got a lot of explanatory material here. In summary, this kind of told us the form, timing, and expected content of the communications, and so hopefully this explanatory material gives us some more details about how to make that happen. So we got A34 through A47 or A46. Okay, so now we're down in the explanatory material section as it relates to the communication process. And so first, we're going to discuss establishing the communication process. And so, as we've seen throughout this section, as well as other AUC sections, we want to have a clear communication and an effective two-way communication. And so, in doing that, we want to communicate to those charged with governance our responsibilities, an overview of the plan, scope, and timing of the audit, as well as the expected general content of communications. And this was all included in our engagement letter that we potentially have those charged with governance sign. But we can certainly also communicate these items in a separate letter or orally. And these were discussed in previous videos. But matters that may also contribute to an effective two-way communication include the discussion of the following items. So we might also inform those charged with governance of the following: the purpose of the communications. So if we are clear about the purpose of why we're communicating to those charged with governance, then we're both in a better position to have a mutual understanding of the relevant issues and expected actions arising from the communication process. We might also let them know the form in which the communications will be made, so whether it's in writing or orally or in an in-person meeting. Also, the person on the audit team and among those charged with governance who will communicate regarding particular matters, so we might let them know that says, hey, Auditor Smith will be the one that's communicating with your board of directors, so direct your communications to him, so on and so forth. We might also let them know the auditor's expectation that communication will be two-way, and those charged with governance will communicate with the auditor matters they consider relevant to the audit. And such matters that we might give them as an example would be strategic decisions that may significantly affect the nature, timing, and extent of audit procedures, the suspicion of detection of fraud, or concerns with the integrity or competence of senior management. So these are all important areas that we want to let them know that we would like to communicate with them about. We might also let them know the process for taking action and reporting back on matters communicated by us, and the process for taking action and reporting back on matters communicated by those charged with governance. And so certainly with different sizes and structures of entities that we audit, the communication process will be different, and will be matters that we consider to be significant and that should be communicated. So we want to use our professional judgment there as far as the extent, form, and content of our communications. But if we seem to be having a difficult time communicating with those charged with governance, that would maybe signal to us that our communications are not adequate. Next, regarding communication with management, a lot of the matters that we will discuss with those charged with governance will also be discussed with management in ordinary course of the audit. But there may be some situations where communicating with management might not be appropriate before we communicate with those charged with governance. For example, asking those charged with governance about management's competence or integrity, we might not inform management about that. But overall, it's typically a good idea to communicate with management before we communicate with those charged with governance, because they would be able to clarify facts and issues for us before we go into those charged with governance, and so we have a good idea of the situation and be ultra informed. Next, regarding forms of communication, This can be done in several ways. We could have a formal presentation. We could have written reports as well as less formal communications, for instance, just short discussions. And so we may communicate matters other than those identified in paragraph 16, either orally or in writing, and written communications may include an engagement letter that is provided to those charged with governance. So a lot of the initial communications to those charged with governance could possibly be through the engagement letter that they sign. And so the form of our communication, for example, whether it's orally or in writing, or it's very detailed, or it's just a summary, or whether it's formal or informal, could be affected by several factors. So we've got a lot of factors here that might weigh on how we actually communicate with those charged with governance. So it'd be whether the matter was satisfactorily resolved. So maybe we wouldn't need to go into much detail about that. Whether management has previously communicated the matter. So if governance already knows about the matter, then we may not need to go into detail about it. The size, operating structure, control environment, and legal structure of the entity being audited. So if there's a less formal structure, if it's a smaller entity, we might not have to have a formal big meeting or discussion with the board, and so on and so forth, and we get the idea there. So when a significant matter is discussed with an individual member of those charged with governance, such as the chair of an audit committee, it may be appropriate for the auditor to summarize the matter in later communications so that all of those charged with governance have full and balanced information. So if we go in and we discuss something really specific with the chair of the audit committee, we might later go back to our office and write up a summary of our discussion to send to the rest of the board so they understand what was discussed and what we concluded regarding a particular matter. And next, regarding the timing of communications. So the appropriate timing for communications will vary the circumstance of the engagement, and considerations include the significance and nature of the matter and the action expected to be taken by those charged with governance. And of course, this timing is a matter of professional judgment, and we may consider the timing of our communications through the following. We might communicate planning matters early in the audit engagement and for an initial engagement as part of the terms of the engagement. And we might communicate significant difficulties encountered during the audit as soon as practical if those charged with governance are able to assist us in overcoming the difficulties, or if the difficulties are likely to lead to a modified opinion. So certainly we would want to communicate the planning matters really early in the engagement, obviously, so that we can put our audit plan together. And also, certainly, we wouldn't want to wait until the end of the audit to finally inform those charged with governance of any findings or issues or significant difficulties that we encountered, because if we let them know about these as soon as possible, we might can resolve them as soon as possible and not get to the end of the engagement and have to rush around and try to fix things when they could have potentially helped us resolve the issues long ago. And other factors that might be relevant to the timing of the communications include the size, operating structure, control environment, and legal structure of the entity being audited. So is it a complex entity or a small company? Any legal obligation to communicate certain matters within a certain specified time frame. Of course, if we need to communicate within a certain time, then that solves our dilemma of the timing that we need to communicate. Expectations of those charged with governance. So they might want us to communicate weekly or something like that, or by a certain time. Typically in engagement, the board might specify they want to have a list of any findings or adjustments or a draft of the financials by a certain date, so they have time to review them and discuss and that sort of thing. Also, the time at which the auditor identifies certain matters. So if we identify something important, we might want to inform the board about it immediately. And finally, the adequacy of the communication process. So we need not design specific procedures to support the evaluation of the two-way communication between us and those charged with governance. So we don't need to have, in particular, like a checklist or some sort of evaluation to say, hey, did we do a two-way communication effectively? But instead, this evaluation might be based on observations resulting from our procedures performed for other purposes. So such examples of those observations might be the appropriate list and timeliness of actions taken by those charged with governance in response to matters communicated by us. So if the board or whoever's those charged with governance hasn't taken action to fix the matters that we found previously, we might ask why and might determine that our two-way communication hasn't been effective. Observations might also be the apparent openness of those charged with governance in their communications with us. So if they seem pretty closed off or absent, then we might conclude our two-way communication isn't effective. Also, the willingness and capacity of those charged with governance to meet with us without management present. The apparent ability of those charged with governance to fully comprehend matters raised by us. So if they don't really comprehend the problems that the matters that we're raising to them, certainly we're not communicating things effectively to them. Also, difficulty in establishing with those charged with governance a mutual understanding of the form, timing, and expected general content of the communication. So if we can't come to a good understanding of what needs to be communicated to us and when and how, we need to consider whether our two-way communications are effective. And also, when all or some of those charged with governance are involved in managing the entity, their apparent awareness of how matters discussed with us affect their broader governance responsibilities as well as their management responsibilities. So if these persons within the entity are not effectively executing their roles as both management and those charged with governance, then we need to communicate with them better. And they further reiterate here the importance of two-way communication with those charged with governance to help us assess the risks of material misstatement, and even a poor two-way communication can have an effect on the audit opinion. So if a two-way communication between us and those charged with governance is not adequate and the situation can't be resolved, then we might need to take one of the following actions. We might need to modify the auditor's opinion on the basis of a scope limitation. So if we feel like the communication was so inadequate that we weren't able to perform all the procedures or get all the information that we needed, then we might have to modify our opinion. Also, we might get legal advice about the consequences of different courses of action to take. We might also communicate with third parties, for instance, the regulators or owners of the business. And we might also withdraw from the engagement when withdrawal is possible under applicable law or regulation. So not having this effective two-way communication with those charged with governance is a really serious issue that could have several negative consequences for the entity that we're auditing.